This is a follow-up to my last video where we modeled a basket using Blender's geometry nodes. In this video, I'm going to show you how to unwrap the basket we made last time and also add a simple but realistic looking texture. I'll put a link up here to the previous video so you can check that out if you want to follow along. I'm pretty excited about how this turned out, so let's get to it. Now let's jump back into our basket file and go into the geometry nodes. Now, before we start, I want to do a little bit of housekeeping and setup to get things ready for us to do the unwrapping and the texturing. So the first thing I want, if we look at the basket, while we're texturing, I want to be able to see more of these horizontal reads. So let's go ahead and actually, rather than just changing it here, we're going to connect it to this socket so that we can control it. Let's hit N, bring out this panel so that we can move this up. I want to put it right below the radius input. And I'll change this to be the horizontal resolution. And let's change that to, I want to say 50, so that you get a nice tight pattern there. And while we're at it, I think I'd like to be able to control this vertical resolution from outside as well. So let's do the same thing. We'll move that up just below the horizontal and rename it vertical resolution. And this one's a little more complicated because remember, if we change this to an odd number, it screws up the math that does the actual weaving, and we want to avoid having that happen. So let's add, let's see, we'll add a math node here and set it to, I'm going to set it to multiply, and we're just going to multiply that by 2. And then we can bring this down a little bit and just bring it down to, say, 25. I think that looks pretty good. The next thing we're going to do, so in order to put a texture on this, to put a material on this, we need to add a set material node. And all this geometry is going to have the same material, so we just put it right at the end here. And rather than just set the material here on the node itself, what I'm going to do is put in another group input, put that here, and I'll connect it to this socket, and that way we can control the material from outside as well. And that way we can have multiple baskets in this scene, and they can all have their own material, which will be a lot better than having them all share the same material. Okay. Now the next thing we're going to do, let's go into the shading tab and set a few things up here. First off, I'm going to switch this render engine to cycles and switch over to the GPU. And also going to set this to the render view. And I think, yeah, I'm going to change the background texture to, let's change it to an environment texture, and I'll open one of my HDRI images. Just use this one. And that's going to be too bright. Let's change this down to 0.6. Maybe 0.5. And the background's a little distracting, so let me just change this down. We'll do film transparent. There you go. So now there's no background. And what we're going to do is we're going to unwrap this using an attribute in the geometry nodes. So let's add a attribute input over here. And we're going to call our attribute XYZ. And you can see everything's 0 right now. I'm actually going to split this up to a separate XYZ. And That's just so that we can see what we're doing when we actually add. We'll start with the x coordinate of this attribute, and yeah, I think we're ready to start unwrapping this basket. So let's jump right back to our geometry nodes, and we're going to set this to be the rendered view as well. And this is showing us the x-coordinate of our xyz attribute, which we haven't actually created in the geometry nodes yet. And we're going to start working right after this, this weave node here. Let's move that back a little ways and move this up. And let's see. So what we want to use for the x-coordinate is actually the circumference of this profile curve. And the way we're going to do that, well, actually here, before we do that, let's add our attribute. So we're going to use a store named attribute node. And this is going to be xyz. And it's going to be a vector. So now if I change this to 1, because that's the x, you can see that's where that's actually going to change. And I'm going to use a combine xyz, and that way we can control each one of those coordinates separately. Now we can start with the x coordinate that we're going to use, and the way we're going to do that is with a spline parameter. And we used this before, but instead of using factor this time, we're going to use the length. And when we connect that up, let's see. Oh. Yeah, that's not exactly what we want. Let's add in a capture attribute. So we're going to get the attribute off of this curve. I'm going to put the value there and use that as the x. Sorry, got ahead of myself. Okay, it's a little hard to see. So I'm actually going to change this back to the factor just to show what's going on. But yeah, so now the circumference of all of these curves, all these profile curves, we're going from 0 and around to 1. Using the length from this spline parameter is actually just using the real length. So instead of going from 0 to 1, it's going from 0 to whatever the circumference of that circle is. And it's very small, which is why it shows up as being pretty dark. But yeah, that's the x coordinate that we're going to use. I'll switch back over to the shading tab real quick, switch this to the y coordinate so that we can see what we're doing. And for the y coordinate, we actually want the distance around the entire basket circumference, which is going to be very similar. So what we're going to do, we're just going to copy this capture attribute and plug it in on the other line for the geometry, for the actual curve going through that curved mesh. And we're going to capture the length from that and plug that into the y. And now you can see we're going from 0 to whatever the circumference is around the outside circumference of the basket. And then for the z coordinate, let's switch over here. We'll switch this to the z, which still has nothing plugged into it. What we want to do here, like a normal UV coordinate would only be 2 dimensions. We're going to use this z coordinate to track the individual reads going around that outside perimeter. So let's copy this capture attribute again. And instead of using point, we're going to switch this to spline. And let's get a index input. And this isn't really necessary. We can change this to integer. Plug that in for the value. And then we'll take this attribute and run it to the z coordinate. And this doesn't look like much. So let's switch back over to shading so I can show you what we're actually doing here. Let's plug in a white noise texture. And we'll throw that in there, and it only needs to be one dimension. Sorry, we'll plug that Z back in. There we go. So now you can see all of those reads around the outside edge all have their own unique Z value. And that'll be useful later. I'll show you what we're doing with that. But for now, let's switch over to the geometry nodes again, because we can use this same setup to give our XYZ to unwrap the bottom of that basket. So let's actually take, let's see, I'll move this over here, and then let's group all of these together with Control G. And then I'll rename this real quick. And actually, I think I'm going to switch these around so it's clear which one's which. So this is our profile curve. So profile curve. And we'll rename this one as curve. And we'll leave everything else the same in here. Go back out and rename this as curve to mesh with XYZ. Sorry, that's kind of a long name. But then we'll take this whole group here and duplicate it and put it down here where we made the bottom of our basket. And you can see that actually breaks everything right away, but if we plug this into the profile curve and then we get rid of this extra curve to mesh, now it looks exactly the way we want it with our Z coordinates there. And then next we'll do the rim around the upper and lower parts of the basket. Now, the process for unwrapping the rim of the basket is pretty similar, but unfortunately we're not going to be able to reuse that same node because it's just slightly different. So let's go into our twisted rim node that we made last time. Let's tab into that. And we're going to add the same, actually move this over further, give us plenty of room to work with. And we're going to add in the store named attribute node here. And again, switch that to, we'll leave that the same. Switch that to vector and name it XYZ. And we're still going to need a combine XYZ node here so we can control each one of those separately. And actually, let's go back to the shading node and set this to the X coordinate again. That way we can see, so with the rest of these, with the rest of the basket, we were taking the Y and Z, we were taking off of the splines that went around the perimeter of the basket. For this, we're actually taking the X and Z off of our instances, and show you real quick, because those instances are from here. Sorry, I always forget. Inside geometry nodes, it's Alt-Shift-Click. So what we're doing is our Z is going to be each one of these individual instances, and our X is going to be the circumference going around each one of those. And sorry, now that I did that, I have to clean it. So let's just go Alt-Shift-click, zoom back out, and go back into our twisted rim node. Okay, so now what we'll do is we'll go up on this instances line and add a capture attribute. And like I said, it's going to look very similar. We're just going to take the spline parameter here, and we'll take the length again, and we'll plug that length into our x coordinate. And it's a little easier to see now just because of that twisting, but again, it's going from 0 around to the circumference of the reed. We'll switch over real quick and switch over to the Y and go back to geometry nodes. And the Y is just going to be the same length off of this spline. So we'll plug that into the Y coordinate. There you go. And switch back over to shading again. We'll take the color off of this white noise and back over to here. And again, instead of the Z coming off of the circumference, now it's actually coming off of the instances that we made up here. So we'll copy that again, capture attribute, and switch this again to spline. And let's add in a index input and plug that in there and plug that into the Z. And now we have a very colorful basket. So let's move this over and we'll put a frame around that. And let's call that, we'll just call that XYZ. All right. And with that, we should be ready to actually start adding a texture to this using the UV unwrap XYZ attribute that we just finished making. So now that we have our XYZ attribute set up, we can actually go back to our shading tab and start using it to create the material that we want for this basket. I'm going to go ahead and get rid of these for now and take this vector over to a noise texture. And let's change this scale up to maybe 15 and do the same with the distortion. And then I'm going to plug in, actually we'll use all three coordinates off of this color. So we'll do a separate XYZ here, and let me see, we'll just use the X, and I'm going to plug that into a map range node, just so we can make it a little more obvious what we're doing. Squash this down a little bit. So we'll go from 0.3 to 0.7, and it'll just make it a little bit easier to see what we're doing, because I want these reeds to look a little bit like wood, I suppose. So we're going to try to get a pretty simple wood grain in there. And if you remember, our y-axis is along the length of these. So let's add in, let's see, we'll do a vector map node, vector map, sorry. Do this to multiply and start these all off at 1. And now I want to stretch out the y so that we have kind of a grain running along the length of our reeds. I think I think 0.15 should work pretty well. Let's try that. And let's add in, let's see, just add in a mix node here and use this as the factor. And I'm going to make this is going to be kind of a red colored basket. Let's zoom in a little bit. Copy that down and then just darken this. Actually, I think I'm just going to take this all the way to black. And I'm going to take the Y coordinate off of this noise pattern and just take that to a bump. Let's see, it'll be the height of that bump node, and put that into the normal. And I want to see how that looks when it's rendered out. It looks good, but it's kind of strong. Let's bring this down. Bring it down to, I think 0.3 might work. So I just want that to be kind of subtle. Let's try that. That might be a little too subtle. No, I think that should work fine. I think that'll look good. So we'll leave that there and plug this color into the base color. And that looks good, but the thing I want to add into this, because I feel like these are all pretty uniform, and I feel like there'd be some variation between all the different reeds going around the edge of this basket. So let's add in, let's actually just duplicate this mix color. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to use this factor to control how dark some of these other reads are. And let's use, from our original vector, we had our z coordinate that gave each one of those a different value. So we'll plug that into the factor. And right away, that is a very, very strong variation. So let's add back the white noise that we had earlier. And I'm just going to use, actually we can do this as a one-dimensional, and I'll use the value from that. And let's see. Let's connect this value to the factor and then go back to the original. So yeah, I think that's still giving us too much of a variation. It looks a little exaggerated. Let's add in another map range. Plug that in here, because this value is going to go from 0 to 1. But instead of going all the way up to 1 here, I want to bring this down so it looks a little bit more natural. Let me put that at 0.7. I feel like maybe I want to move it. There you go. I think 0.8 works pretty well. And that way you just have a little bit more variation between those. Sorry, I could play with this all day. Let's just split the difference, 0.85. I like that. There you go. That's a nicely textured basket. Let's actually change this down. I think this should be a little bit less glossy. I think that looks pretty good. And with this setup, using just black for these. You can actually change this, and maybe you want more of a neutral colored basket, or just kind of a light color. You can play around with that, and it still looks pretty realistic in my opinion. You can also have just a painted basket that still has that texture on it, and that's not bad either. So there you go. That's how I unwrap and texture this procedural basket. I hope you found this tutorial helpful. I really enjoyed putting it together. If you have any suggestions, feel free to leave a comment down below. Otherwise, keep an eye out for more content, and I'll see you in the next one.